while the plant manager raised a glass in the atrium of the Meridian Hotel. Marble floors, open bar, 200 guests in business casual, celebrating a contract that would keep Halverson Dynamics solvent at 4 years to Huishurst. Joel Whitaker was standing alone in Bay 7 of the main facility, watching a pressure calibration unit throw readings that didn't belong in any normal operating window. It was 11:43 at night. The party was 6 miles away, and Joel had not been invited. He hadn't been left off the list by accident. There was no oversight, no clerical error, no moment where someone in the events department said, "Wait, we forgot someone." His name had simply not come up. Not in the planning meeting, not in the final guest count, not on the printed programs that sat in neat stacks at the registration table. Joel Whitaker, senior systems engineer, 17 years at Halverson Dynamics, the man who had spent the last 8 months quietly reconstructing the pressure management architecture that made the new contract possible in the first place. He had not been considered. He filed the calibration report at 12:50 in the morning, stayed another 40 minutes to verify. The corrective hold was stable, and drove home in the dark. His daughter Ellie was asleep on the couch when he got in. She was 11 years old and had learned, the way children of working parents learn, how to fall asleep waiting. She had left the kitchen light on for him. There was a plate of food wrapped in foil on the counter. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at it and thought about the party he had not attended and found that he did not particularly want to think about it. So he ate standing up and washed the plate himself and carried Ellie to her bed without waking her. That was the kind of man Joel Whitaker was. His wife, Karen, had died 3 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, fast and without mercy. He had taken 6 weeks of bereavement leave and come back to work before anyone expected him to, not because he had processed the loss, but because the alternative was sitting in a house that still smelled like her shampoo and having nothing to do with his hands. He had 2 children. Ellie was 8 when Karen died. His son, Marcus, no relation to anyone at the plant, was 14 and had gone quiet in the way teenage boys go quiet when the world removes something essential from them. Joel had watched his son grow careful in a way that broke something in him every day. He kept working. He kept showing up. He made Ellie's lunch every morning and checked Marcus's homework every night. And on weekends he fixed things around the house that didn't need fixing just to keep moving. At Halverson Dynamics, he was known as the person you called when a system stopped making sense. Not the first call, usually the third or fourth after the junior engineers had tried their approaches, and the senior technicians had escalated and someone finally said, "Has anyone talked to Whitaker?" His office, if it could be called that, it was more of a converted storage room at the end of the secondary corridor, had a whiteboard covered in diagrams no one else fully understood, and a shelf of binders that hadn't been digitized because he found it faster to keep from. He did not go to company lunches. He did not attend the quarterly town halls unless attendance was mandatory. He fixed things and went home. The contract celebration had been organized by Stuart Poole, the plant manager, a man who had been at Halverson for 18 months, and who spoke often about momentum and alignment, and who had a gift for making people in conference rooms feel that something significant was about to happen. Stuart Poole was 43, wore his shirts untucked in a way that read as intentional, and had taken credit in the client presentations for the pressure architecture improvements without specifying who had actually done the work. He had not done this maliciously, exactly. He had done it the way people in his position often do, by describing team accomplishments in the first-person plural until the distinction between team and self becomes sufficiently blurred. We developed, we implemented, we resolved. The contract was with Corrigan Aero, a mid-sized aerospace components manufacturer that had been looking for a domestic supplier capable of meeting their tolerance specifications. The specifications were not gentle. Corrigan Aero's quality standards exceeded what most domestic facilities could reliably achieve, and the reason Halverson Dynamics had been able to meet them came down, almost entirely to a series of modifications Joel had made to the facility's pressure regulation system over the preceding 8 months. Modifications he had proposed twice before through official channels without response, then implemented quietly when a minor production issue gave him the opening. Stuart Poole knew Joel had been involved in the technical work. What Stuart Poole did not know, or had not bothered to learn, was the degree to which the entire Corrigan relationship rested on Joel's specific competencies. This distinction would become relevant in approximately 60 days. The morning after the party, Joel came in at his usual time, which was 6:15, 90 minutes before anyone else. He made coffee in the break room and reviewed the overnight calibration logs, and found that the unit he had stabilized the night before had held clean through the shift. He documented this and moved on. He did not mention the party. He did not mention that he had not been there. A few colleagues who had attended said things like, "It was a good time," and "Too bad you missed it," and Joel said he'd heard it went well and changed the subject because he genuinely had no interest in discussing it. What he did have interest in was a secondary anomaly he'd noticed in the Corrigan production logs, a variance pattern in the output from line 4 that shouldn't have been there given the parameters they were running. It was subtle, the kind of thing that wouldn't flag automatically, wouldn't catch anyone's attention in a standard review, wouldn't appear in a summary report. But Joel had been running this type of system long enough that subtle wrongness registered for him the way a slightly off-note registers for a musician who has played the same piece for 20 years. He pulled the raw data and sat with it. The variance was not random. It had a shape to it. Not dramatic, not alarming if you were scanning for alarms, but consistent in a way that suggested something upstream was off. Something in the feed pressure cycle, specifically in the transition interval between the primary and secondary hold stages. He ran comparisons against the baseline they'd established during the qualification runs in March, and found that the current output was diverging from that baseline by a margin that was, at present, within Corrigan's tolerance window, but trending. If the trend continued at its current rate, they would breach the tolerance threshold in approximately 3 weeks. 3 weeks. With a 4-year contract 6 days old, Joel wrote up what he found and sent it to his direct supervisor, a man named Dwight Haynes, who had been at Halverson for 11 years and who was competent and overworked, and who Joel respected in the straightforward way he respected most people who showed up and did their jobs. The message was detailed and specific. It identified the variance, described the pattern, provided the baseline comparison, and outlined 2 potential root causes. Dwight Haynes forwarded it to Stuart Poole. Stuart Poole did not respond to Joel directly. What he did, instead, was call a meeting the following afternoon that included Dwight, the production floor supervisor, a woman named Beverly Crane who ran Line 4 and who had been at the plant for 22 years, and who had quietly agreed with Joel's concerns when he'd mentioned them informally, and a man named Derek Solis, who had joined Halverson 8 months ago as Director of Operations and who reported directly to Poole. Joel was not in this meeting. What came out of it, as relayed to Joel by Dwight afterward, was that Stuart Poole had reviewed the data and determined that the variance was within acceptable parameters and did not require immediate action. Derek Solis had agreed. Beverly Crane had not agreed, but had not been given much room to say so. The meeting had lasted 35 minutes and concluded with a directive that the current production protocol would continue unchanged and that the matter would be flagged for review at the next monthly quality session. The next monthly quality session was 26 days away. Joel read Dwight's summary of the meeting twice and then sat for a while, looking at his whiteboard. He was a patient man. This had not always been true. Karen used to say that he had learned patience the hard way, which was the only way it stuck, but it was true now. He thought carefully about what he was going to do. He wrote a second memo. This one was more formal. It laid out the variance data again, more comprehensively this time, including a statistical projection of where the numbers would be in 3 weeks if the current trend held. It was not a memo designed to alarm. It was a memo designed to be accurate. He sent it to Dwight and asked that it be documented in the project file. Dwight confirmed it was received. Nothing changed. What Joel did not know at that point, what no one below the level of Stuart Poole and Derek Solis knew, was that the production protocol had been modified 6 weeks earlier in a way that had not been disclosed internally. The modification had been made to increase output speed in response to a delivery schedule Poole had committed to in the contract negotiations without consulting the engineering team. The faster pace was achievable. It was also, as Joel had now identified, creating a pressure inconsistency that the original qualification runs had not accounted for because the original qualification runs had been done at a different pace. Derek Solis had flagged this to Poole privately 3 weeks after the protocol change. Poole had told him to manage it. Solis had managed it by adjusting the reporting parameters so that the variance wouldn't automatically trigger the quality escalation flag that fed into Corrigan's supplier oversight system. This was not technically falsification. It was, in a more honest framing, the kind of decision that people make when they have committed to something they cannot deliver, and have decided that the gap between the commitment and reality is someone else's problem to inherit. Joel did not know any of this. He knew only what the data was showing him. 41 days after the contract celebration, Joel received a call at home on a Tuesday evening. It was Beverly Crane, and she was calling from the plant, and her voice had the quality of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally decided to put it down regardless of where it lands. She told him what she knew. She told him that the output from line 4 had been running under modified parameters for 6 weeks. She told him that the variance he had flagged was not a random anomaly. It was a direct result of the pace modification and the reporting adjustment. She told him she had become aware of the reporting change 2 weeks ago and had asked Derek Solis about it and been told it was a technical calibration that didn't affect quality outputs. She told him she had not believed that then and did not believe it now. Joel listened without interrupting. He asked one question when she finished. Was the current output still within Corrigan's tolerance window? Beverly said yes, but barely. He said he would take care of it. He stayed on the phone with Ellie long enough to tell her he had to go back to the plant and that there was money in the drawer if she needed to order something for dinner and that Marcus should be home by 8. Ellie said, "Okay, Dad." She was 11 years old and she said it the way she said everything, with a directness that reminded him of Karen so sharply sometimes that it felt like a physical thing. He drove back to the plant at 9:15 in the evening. He pulled the full production data for the 6 weeks since the protocol change. Not the summary reports, not the dashboard numbers, the raw output logs, the pressure cycle records, the calibration timestamps, everything that fed into the reporting system before the reporting parameters had been adjusted. He worked through it systematically, which was the only way he knew how to work, and by 1 in the morning, he had a complete picture of what had happened. The variance was trending faster than his initial projection had suggested. At the current rate, they would breach Corrigan's tolerance threshold in approximately 9 days. Not 3 weeks. The pace had increased in the 2 weeks since his second memo, which had accelerated the drift. 9 days. He thought about sending another memo to Dwight. He thought about it for approximately 4 minutes and then decided against it. Not because he wanted to go around his supervisor, but because a memo that went to Dwight would go to Poole. And Poole had already demonstrated what he did with information he found inconvenient. What Joel needed was for the right information to reach the right people before the threshold breach occurred and Corrigan began seeing it in their incoming components. He spent the next 2 hours writing the most careful document he had written in 17 years at Halverson Dynamics. It was a technical disclosure memo addressed to the quality assurance director. a woman named Patricia Okafor who had been in her role for 6 years, and who reported to the CFO rather than to Pool's operational chain. It laid out the full picture, the original qualification parameters, the protocol modification and its date, the reporting adjustment and its effect on the automated escalation system, the variance trend from day 1 to the present, the 9-day projection, and 2 options for corrective action, one that would require a temporary production slowdown, and one that was faster but more expensive. He did not characterize anyone's decisions as falsification. He did not use the word misconduct. He described what had happened and what the data showed and what the options were, and he did so in language precise enough that no one reading it could claim ambiguity. He sent it to Patricia Okafor at 3:14 in the morning and copied Dwight Haynes. Then he went home. Ellie was asleep in her bed this time. Marcus's light was off. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet in the early morning, that specific stillness that belongs to a time when most of the world is not yet awake. Joel stood in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and thought about Karen, which was something he did regularly and without particular pain anymore. It had been 3 years and grief had done what grief does when you don't fight it, which is that it had settled into something he could carry. He thought about what she would have said about what he'd just done. He thought she would have said, "Of course you did." She had known him well enough to know that he didn't have another option, not one he could live with. He was at the plant by 6:15 the next morning. Patricia Okafor called him at 7:45 and asked if he could come to her office. He went. She had the memo open on her screen, and she had clearly been in the building since before he arrived. She asked him 3 questions, all of them technical, and he answered each one precisely. Then she told him she was going to take this to the CFO that morning, and that she wanted him available if there were additional questions. He said he would be available. The next 4 days were the kind of days that are difficult to describe to people who have not experienced them. The particular texture of time that exists when a serious problem is being worked at multiple levels simultaneously, and you are not at the center of it, but you are close enough to feel the pressure from all directions. Patricia Okafor met with the CFO. The CFO contacted the board. Stuart Poole was summoned to a meeting he had not been warned about. Derek Solis was summoned separately. What emerged from those conversations over the course of 72 hours was an accounting that was comprehensive and not flattering to either man. The protocol modification had not been disclosed to the engineering team. The reporting adjustment had not been disclosed to the quality assurance function, and the aggregate effect of both decisions was that Halverson Dynamics had been shipping components to Corrigan Aero for 6 weeks under parameters that deviated from the qualification standard in a way that Corrigan had not been informed of. The decision about what to do with this information had to be made quickly, because the threshold breach was now 6 days away. Patricia Okafor came to Joel's office at 7 in the morning on the 5th day since he had sent the memo. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the only other chair in the room, and asked him to walk her through the 2 corrective options he had outlined. They went through both in detail. The first option, the slower one, would require a 4-day production halt and a recertification run before Line 4 could resume at current capacity. The second option would require significant cost but could be completed in 36 hours. Patricia asked which one he thought was right. Joel said the first one because the second one would fix the immediate problem but wouldn't give them the full verification data they needed to stand behind the output going forward, and they were going to need that verification data when they disclosed to Corrigan. But Patricia looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's what I thought too." The disclosure letter to Corrigan Aero went out that same afternoon. Patricia had written it, but she had asked Joel to review the technical sections, and he had rewritten them in the plain factual language that characterized everything he put on paper. The letter described the deviation, the timeline, the corrective action that was being implemented, and the verification steps that would confirm the issue had been resolved. It was not a letter designed to minimize, it was a letter designed to be honest. Corrigan Aero's quality director called within 3 hours of receiving it. The conversation lasted 90 minutes, most of which was technical. Patricia participated. Joel participated when the questions required his specific knowledge, which was frequently. The quality director at Corrigan was a man named Harold Finch, who had been in aerospace quality assurance for 30 years, and who did not have a great deal of patience for ambiguity, but who had, as became apparent over the course of the call, a great deal of respect for specificity. Joel was specific. When Harold asked about the variance trend, Joel gave him numbers. When Harold asked about the corrective methodology, Joel described it in terms that Harold recognized as technically sound. When Harold asked whether the components already shipped were within tolerance, Joel said yes, and he could demonstrate it, and he described how. At the end of the call, Harold Finch said he would need to review the verification data once the corrective run was complete before he could confirm they were proceeding with the contract. He did not say they were terminating. The production halt began the following morning. Joel ran the recertification process himself. He brought Beverly Crane in to supervise the output verification because she knew Line 4 the way he knew the pressure systems, from years of daily contact, from the specific kind of knowledge that cannot be acquired through training alone. They worked through it over 3 days, methodical and thorough, and when the run was complete, the numbers were clean. Not approximately clean. Precisely within qualification. Joel sent the verification package to Patricia Okafor, and Patricia sent it to Harold Finch. Stuart Poole was placed on administrative leave on the 4th day of the production halt. Derek Solis resigned the following morning. Joel learned about both of these things not through any official communication but through Beverly Crane, who had been informed by the plant's HR director, and who called Joel to tell him because she thought he should know. He listened and said he was sorry to hear it, which was the kind of thing he said when he didn't have anything better to say and didn't want to say nothing. His son Marcus called him that evening, which was unusual because Marcus generally communicated by text. Marcus was 17 now and had come out of the quiet phase gradually, the way seasons change. You don't notice it day by day, but you notice one morning that something is different. He called to ask how things were going at work. Joel said things were complicated, but he thought they were going to be okay. Marcus said that sounded like dad speak, for it's fine, but I'm exhausted. Joel laughed, which was also unusual, and said that was about right. After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen for a while. The house had the evening quality it got in late autumn, that particular combination of lamplight and early dark, outside the windows that made the inside feel both contained and sufficient. Ellie was doing homework at the table. She was using a pencil and making small, precise marks in the margin of her worksheet, the same way he made small, precise marks on paper when he was working through something. He had not noticed this before, or he had noticed it and not quite registered it as the thing it was. Corrigan Aero's quality director sent the written confirmation 4 days after receiving the verification package. The contract would continue. He noted in the letter that he had been in this industry long enough to know the difference between a vendor who managed a problem and a vendor who concealed one, and that the manner in which this situation had been disclosed and resolved had, in his assessment, demonstrated the kind of integrity that was relevant to a 4-year supply relationship. Patricia Okafor forwarded that letter to the full board with a cover note that named Joel Whitaker specifically. The CFO called Joel directly that afternoon. The conversation was short. The CFO said that the board had reviewed the situation and that Joel's role at Halverson Dynamics was going to be formally restructured to reflect the scope of responsibility he had actually been carrying. He said there were specifics to work out and asked if Joel could come in for a longer conversation next week. Joel said yes. The CFO said, and I want to say this directly, "We should have been paying closer attention for a long time." Joel said he appreciated that. He did not say that it was all right, because it hadn't entirely been, and he was not the kind of person who said things that weren't true just to make a conversation easier. A company-wide meeting was held the following Thursday to address what had happened and what was changing. The interim plant manager, a woman named Catherine Briggs, who had been brought in from the parent company, while a permanent replacement was identified, opened the meeting and gave a summary that was honest about what had occurred and how it had been addressed. She said that the company had come closer to a significant loss of both contract and reputation than most people in the building probably realized, and that the reason it had been avoided was specific. She named Joel Whitaker. She described what he had done, not in vague terms, not in the language of team effort and collective achievement, but in specific terms that made clear what one person's decision to document and disclose had meant for everyone in that room. Joel was in the back of the meeting space, standing near the wall because the chairs had filled up. He was holding a coffee cup and looking at the floor while Catherine Briggs said these things, because being looked at while people described him was not something he was comfortable with and never had been. Several colleagues near him glanced over, and a few of them nodded. Beverly Crane caught his eye from across the room and gave him a small, direct nod that communicated something cleaner and more specific than any of the handshakes that followed. After the meeting, people came to find him, colleagues he hadn't spoken to in months, people who worked in departments he rarely interacted with. They said things like, "I didn't know the full story," and "I'm glad it worked out." He thanked them and meant it, in the particular way you mean something when you have been carrying a thing alone for a while and the carrying is now done. That evening, he picked Ellie up from school, and on the way home she asked him, out of nowhere, whether it was true that he'd saved the company. He asked her how she'd heard that. She said Marcus had told her. He said that was a bigger way to put it than he would have. She said that was probably why Marcus put it that way. He looked at her in the rearview mirror, and she was looking back at him with the expression she got, sometimes, slightly too old for her age in the way children who have lost a parent get too old for their age. And he thought about Karen again, the same way he always thought about her, which was with a specific gratitude for the time there had been, and without the wish that things had gone differently. Because he had learned, over 3 years, that the wish was the part that cost you. He said he supposed he had helped. Ellie said that was also probably a bigger way to put it than he would have. He said she was probably right. They drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that requires no filling. 2 weeks later, Catherine Briggs asked Joel to review the facility's reporting architecture and make recommendations for how it should be restructured so that what had happened with the production data could not happen again. He spent 3 days doing this and produced a 20-page document that was technical and specific, and that did not read like something produced by a committee. Catherine implemented 12 of the 14 recommendations within the month. At the parent company's annual operations review, held in Cincinnati in early December, Joel Whitaker was listed in the presenter materials as the engineer whose intervention had preserved the Corrigan Aero contract. His name was in the printed program. It was in the digital presentation that went to the board. Stuart Poole's name appeared nowhere in the materials. Joel sat in the 3rd row and listened to the summary, and at the appropriate moment he presented the technical overview of the corrective action and the verification methodology, clearly and without embellishment, the same way he did everything. Harold Finch was in the room, having been invited as a courtesy given Corrigan's stake in the situation. After the presentation, Harold crossed the room and shook Joel's hand and said he had, in 30 years, met perhaps a dozen engineers he trusted on first principles, and that Joel was now on that list. Joel thanked him and meant it. He called Marcus from the hotel that evening, which Marcus would later describe as the first time he could remember his father calling him from a work trip. They talked for 40 minutes. Marcus asked questions about how the pressure systems worked, and Joel found himself explaining, slowly at first, and then with increasing detail, because Marcus was genuinely following it, and that was the kind of thing Joel could never resist. A question asked in honest interest, waiting for an honest answer. He flew home the next morning. Ellie had left the kitchen light on again. There was nothing on the counter this time, because she had learned at some point in the preceding weeks that he would eat when he was hungry and didn't need to be waited on, which was its own kind of growing up, and he was not entirely sure how he felt about it. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment and thought that he had done the right thing, which was the thought he had every time he did the right thing. Not satisfaction. Exactly, because the right thing had cost something, it had always cost something, but the absence of the alternative, which was to have done otherwise, and to have lived with knowing it. He had 17 years of showing up at this plant. He had 2 children who were going to be all right. He had a body of work that was documented in binders no one else fully understood and in systems that ran clean because he had made them clean, and in one 4-year aerospace contract that existed in part because of a night he had spent alone in Bay 7, while 200 people raised their glasses 6 miles away. He went to bed. He was at the plant by 6:15 the next morning.